Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This one is jointly hosted by the USC Price School of Public Policy and the USC Schaefer Center. My name is Dana Goldman. I'm the interim dean at the Price School, and I'm also the director of the Schaefer Center. And this is an enormously important topic right now to discuss the future of higher education. And I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Raynard Kington. I want to remind audience members that they can submit questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And this pandemic has disrupted a lot of what we do in the field of higher education. You can see that I'm in my home rather than in the dean's office. And I can't think of anyone better to have a discussion about what this disruption means for the future than Dr. Raynard Kington. He's currently the head of school at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. For those of you who don't know what Andover is, it was founded in 1778. It's probably one of the oldest and most elite secondary schools in the country. It's trained presidents, foreign heads of state, Nobel laureates, and 6 medals of honor recipients. And as a public school kid from the Boston area, I hated every one of your graduates. So, but prior to leading Andover, he also served as president of Grinnell College for 10 years. And before that, he held a number of positions at the National Institutes of Health, including the principal deputy director at NIH. Dr. Kington attended the University of Michigan, where he received both his BS with distinction and his MD, and he completed his residency in internal medicine at Michael Reese Medical Center in Chicago. He was a Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, where he completed his MBA with distinction and his PhD in health policy and economics at the Wharton School, and was awarded the Fontaine Fellowship. Welcome, Raynard, and please, I'm going to give you the floor to open with some remarks.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to join everyone here today. I hope I'm still moving.
Yes, I'll let you know if we have any technical problems. Yeah.
Well, this is a huge topic, the future of higher education. And we're at this extraordinary moment. So even prior to the pandemic, higher education was facing tremendous challenges. And I would characterize several of the key challenges are: one, at least the list price, the listed price of higher ed was going up. And the higher ed price index exceeds the price in the overall CPI for many years, and our cost structure was going up. At the same time, students in some subsets of the population were accumulating significant amounts of debt. I think it's not as pervasive as many people think. Most of the debt is pretty reasonable, but there are clearly a subset of people who are getting pretty large debt burdens to go through college and graduate school. At the same time, there's growing awareness that higher ed is sort of a necessary ticket to a sort of comfortable life in this economy. And that overall, in spite of questions being raised, overall, there's a pretty compelling evidence base of a pretty good return on that investment for society and for individuals. And at the same time, growing concerns about inequality and this incredible range of institutions that you have. There are 4,000 institutions of higher education, over 4,000 in the United States. And much of our conversation is about a relatively small slice of that population. So anytime you have that large of an array of institutions, trying to figure out anything sort of to say about all of them is difficult. And so you we have great challenges talking about this whole community of institutions when they're so varied. And then we have on top of that, and there are lots of other concerns, but then on top of that now we have this pandemic, which has threatened the business model of lots of institutions. Many institutions were forced to go online in the spring and are continuing in the fall to be online. And that means they aren't receiving revenue for room and board. And many institutions, that's a major source of revenue that sort of helps their whole sort of economic ecosystem work. So that's gone off. And then the routine costs of higher ed in the face of the pandemic have gone up, whether it's testing or tints or screening. I mean, just go down the list, millions and millions and millions. I was speaking to one institution that was several months into the pandemic, was already over $100 million of lost revenue. And many of their costs have not dropped significantly. In some cases, there have been layoffs, and I think there'll be more. So all of this, and then on top of all of that, we have this moment of racial reckoning. So it's hard to imagine a more difficult time for higher ed probably in the last 100 years. Yeah. So the question is, what will happen? What will come out of the tube at the end of this moment? And we're not at all sure.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk to you some more about that. And that's a perfect introduction to what I hope will be a conversation. Because you came from a school, when you were at Grinnell, it had a pretty large endowment, as I understand it, per capita. And we have enormous heterogeneity in the resources. And there's an urge to do as much as you can for students who are traditionally take on a lot of debt. And that's limited, obviously, by the resources that are available, especially if the federal government is not supporting a lot of it. And, so places like Harvard, Princeton, and now USC actually can promise to support full aid for some people, and I assume Grinnell was there for some students, but actually there are a lot of schools that just can't afford to offer that. And if they have, as you said, costs are going up, tuition can't keep going up at the rate you're talking about. Are these schools going to just fold, and what does that mean for opportunity in the U.S.?
So I don't think there's any question that schools are going to close. There's been conversations about this for a number of years, particularly smaller institutions. We have a very inefficient system of education, sort of by design, and that's sort of what makes us special, our inefficiency. So I don't think there's any question that there are institutions that have a very sort of costly model. So small, for example, I think less than 5% of students go to sort of small liberal arts colleges, but it's a very expensive model. And we have a lot of small liberal arts colleges spread across the country. In Iowa, every religious group in the country, it seems, sent out ministers in the 1800s to start churches and colleges, and they did. So you have all these small colleges that don't have a lot of resources, with a very expensive model of education, and there is very little, and they don't have big endowment. So you're right, Grinnell was this anomaly in that Grinnell had at its peak, and probably still does, like $2 billion endowment. So we had over $1 million per student. Almost, I think, 30% of students had enough financial aid so that basically the tuition was free. Our average debt was the lowest in the state of Iowa and among the lowest among private schools in the country. So we were this anomaly. The most of our peers in the state of Iowa were small private institutions, didn't have large endowments, didn't have the reputation or the brand strength to demand full pay by kids who didn't accumulate debt. Where people who didn't have to worry about debt went and parents wrote checks $50,000, $60,000 a year and didn't think about the debt. So this gets to this issue of heterogeneity, though. while a lot of time has been spent on these private institutions, the vast majority of students aren't there. They're at community colleges and public comprehensive universities and the big public universities. And one of the stories that I didn't tell is also important is the clear divestment of state governments in their state educational systems. You're in healthcare. Some blame this on Medicaid, and there's probably some evidence to show that that's been one of the drivers. Dollars have gone from higher ed to Medicaid or healthcare. So that those institutions have been under tremendous strain and now are reaching these, we're having all of these pressures forced to the absolute breaking point because of the pandemic. And so I think some institutions will close, and I think we'll also see some creative solutions where we're already beginning to see the first trickle of proposed mergers, and institutions fundamentally changing their cost structures, laying off faculty, for example, tenure track faculty, laying off their infrastructure of staff. So we're in this moment of crisis. The tragedy is that our educational system is more than just a bunch of schools. These institutions are often the anchor institutions in their communities, especially in smaller communities. They often are the major employers. They have traditionally been a stepping stone for social mobility, although I know that there have been challenges with that. These institutions they've been the repository of knowledge for our culture in lots of ways. They've been places where at least we're supposed to have great debates about ideas that make us uncomfortable. So these institutions play these other roles in society. And I worry that we're going to look back and see a lot of institutions hit a stopping point and having to close. And the price is going to be higher than many people think.
Well, that's well said. And those ancillary consequences are something that don't get talked about a lot. And you're absolutely right. So we've talked a lot about the supply side and what's going on there. I want to talk about the demand side in the following sense, that students' interests seem to have changed. It's more important. The humanities, maybe it's due to the cost in some ways, but the humanities, the liberal arts have been affected. They have more of an interest in some ways in changing the world. Have you seen a trend like that? And what does it mean for the educational experience that universities provide?
So basically, every institution in America seeing the shift away from some humanities and social studies majors towards science, technology. Someone was saying that at Stanford, basically every single student takes Introduction to Computer Science. Like, whether it's not required, it's just every single student takes it, no matter what your major is. Well, that was not the case 20 years ago, and that class is replacing something, and it's not replacing chemistry. It's probably replacing an humanities class. So there have been reports at Harvard and Princeton and Stanford over the last 10 or 15 years. Everyone's worried about this, and with good cause. I think this is another example where I certainly understand the conventional wisdom and the evidence base that students get a significant bump in their return on their investment in the sciences. And I'm a scientist. I believe in science. I think it's great. But I also think that we've, as a society, undervalued the investment in many of our humanities. And I think what doesn't get quantified as clearly is the way that humanistic education of all sorts really has the potential to open up students' minds in ways that you can't get any other way to do it. I mean, how else to sort of, in this time of huge, incredible racial reckoning and unrest, how else could the average white person in America understand what it's like to be a person of color except through literature, where you can literally get into the mind of someone who's not like you? And I think sort of functions like that have been greatly undervalued they're hard to value. I understand that. Technically, they're hard to value. But I think there's this, we will pay a high social cost if we just sort of let these disciplines sort of die. Now, I don't think that will happen. In fact, I think that a traditional liberal arts education across fields where you have a broad base has never been more valuable. And the reason is because it provides this base for learning for the rest of your life, and the way that narrow education, a large percentage, I think the most common major is business. Well, there's a lot of evidence that many of our business majors aren't getting this high quality education, with all due respect. And, I'm a graduate of business school, I understand that, but there are a lot of business majors out there who are not getting this first rate education. They aren't learning how to write and think creatively and understand the world in a complicated way. And I think that we need a course correction. And I think parents who really are able to sort of look, and students who are able to sort of see this longer view, realize, I think, the value of this broad base of education, particularly the value of knowing how to communicate and understanding the sort of groundings of our society and all the complexity of that grounding. And I think that those are good investments. So if I were to tell my kid, I used to joke that we had a lot of students who would say they were computer science majors and philosophy majors, and computer for their parents and philosophy is for them, and that was the negotiated agreement.
Well, by the way, all the business students just dropped off, so you could say more. But actually,
are business professors. So.
But I think those complementarities are important. Actually, the way people study philosophy today, for example, a lot of it is logic based, and that's also what we do in computer science. So we're seeing that a lot of the master's degree students are actually coming out of places like philosophy.
Yeah,
so if
students are really doing well, actually.
Yeah. And you get, as you said, you get a much more well-rounded, if I could paraphrase. So, in some sense, that's an advantage we feel at a university like at USC, where you have a very broad curriculum. You have professional schools that can offer education at both the postgraduate and undergraduate level, and also offer the standard liberal arts. And so we argue that makes us better, but as we would.
Make the argument. It's a valid argument.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. And one other, so the other trend that you mentioned, and it has been obviously accelerated by COVID, is this move online. And, as much as we try, it's difficult. It's more difficult, I think, to keep students interested and working towards the objectives of the course. And it also brings up the issue of whether we should have this atomistic model where a lot of small classes by teachers who vary in quality, or suppose you, for example, you have one professor who's fantastic at one course. Should they teach it for the whole country? So are we going to end up with a model where there are a few faculty teaching thousands of people at a time?
Well, I think we'll see some of that. My understanding is that in many medical schools, there's a lot of sort of shared, that a lot of students don't go to the lectures in the early years, and that there's a lot of shared understanding about which lectures are available and which places that are the best, and that a lot of students' learning is outside the classroom now. I think it always was, but it really is now. I think we will see some of that. Certainly, I think the pandemic and its forced experimentation with online learning and teaching is a game changer. There will be clearly, there are a lot of people come back and say, God, I never want to do that again. I get that. But there are also a lot of people saying, some dimensions it worked. And I think that this opportunity to use sort of these for example, the opportunity to use these extraordinary lectures, I think faculty may start using those as sort of like textbooks, that it's sort of complementary to what goes on in a classroom. And I would argue that while it may very well be true that there are these superstar lecturers who somehow can just communicate an idea well, and God bless them, we should use them as much as we can. I've on more than one occasion when I've had to help my kids, I've rushed to Khan Academy when I've forgotten a concept that I hadn't thought about in 30 years. And that's great. And I think we'll see those resources as a complement to the more nuanced sort of dynamic that comes through in a classroom. And for some people, it may be the only way to get that education. I think there will be people, girls in certain cultures that don't support education for girls, who now can go online and get access to an education and by some of those professors. I mean, I think that still holds a lot of promise for sort of opening doors of access. But what I'm concerned about is that this will sort of push even more this stratification of the educational experience. So, at many institutions of the elite colleges, the top 50 or so, many colleges and universities, many of those are spending $100,000 per year, close to between $80,000 and $100,000 per year per student. And, that's real money. And they're not like, everyone talks about the lazy rivers and all these things. That's not what's being spent. It's small classes, highly skilled faculty, lots of complementary resources and assistance. And what worries me is that we'll continue to see that type of education sort of separate away from sort of just the facts educate, sort of the watch the video, come in and take the test, all online. You'll learn some basic facts and you'll be educated and you'll be better than you would be otherwise, but you won't have that extra thing that comes from elite education in the United States. And so it worries me that that this will push that even more, this divide between your basic education and this, what is increasingly rare and extraordinary education of incredible, intense relationships for 4 years with small classes and really opening people's minds in ways it just can't happen the same way online, I think. It can go far, but it can't go all the way there.
Wow. Thank you. That was great. And actually, I want to ask my next question, but I think that may have answered it in some ways. It's actually coming through the Q&A, and I want to invite people to submit their questions. But we're now seeing large, rich, private companies, for-profit companies, getting into education because perhaps because they feel people aren't being trained. So Google would be the most notable example. How do you see that affecting higher education?
Well, I think for the most part, I see it as sort of running in parallel rather than being being a complement rather than being a substitute for traditional higher education. So-called stackable credentials, where you get all these little pieces of knowledge. I think that's wonderful. And you know what? It's always happened. In some ways, it took place in the workplace. It took place and also, with internships. And there are all sorts of ways that we've had these more concentrated, sort of very skill-based learning in various ways. And so, and there's more of it happening. And I think it's wonderful. And there are types of education that actually probably are optimally given in that format. I also think, though, that we're foolish if we think that if you just have enough of that, that's the same as this intensive, broad, we're going to open your mind across all these different fields, and you're going to learn what it means to be thrown and to figure out a culture and to understand a language. And all these things, it's not the same. And that doesn't devalue what Google's doing. God bless them. I think it's they're doing great things, I'm sure. But it's different. It's not the same.
Yeah. Okay, we've got some more questions, and one of them is coming in, and I know you spent a lot of time with the National Institute on Aging, and you've studied the life cycle. And one of the questions is, and actually you're moving earlier in the life cycle now to educate people, but I want to talk about lifetime learning and what you talked about it, modular education.
Yeah.
And where do you see that going?
So, this is an area where I think higher ed has talked a good game, but actually hasn't changed much, with the exception of professional education. I was in the last group of people who took the board certification exam in internal medicine when they could take it once and be certified for life. So technically, I'm still board certified as in internal medicine, public health, and preventive medicine. There's a reason why they changed that, because that was ludicrous, that you're going to test once and the whole body of knowledge would churn, and 10 years later, you're doing it made no sense. And so I think professions have got, particularly science and particularly the health professions, have really sort of are fully on board for lifelong learning. And I think that's in the educational process has changed as a result of that in lots of ways. But I think when it comes to all the other disciplines, particularly the less not scientific and non-professional, there isn't this same sense of learning for yourself and for your growth as an individual, and maybe to help you become a better parent or better spouse or better community member. When I first came to Grinnell, I was invited to go to this small town like 30 minutes away. I mean, we're talking small. Grinnell was 9,000. This was probably a 3,000 person town with one school that went from kindergarten up to high school, one facility. And they asked me to speak to the students, the senior students there, and I did. And somehow the conversation, so my spouse is Greek American, and we spend a lot of time in Greece. And I was saying, we spend most of the summer, up until this summer, on Crete. And Crete's an interesting culture where there's been all these different cultures and was under Ottoman rule for this long period of time. And somehow I started talking about that and said, well, I noticed that when I was there, I realized that I probably had an hour's worth of education about the Ottoman Empire in my entire education. And, Ottoman Empire was a big deal. It was like it controlled a big chunk of the world in lots of ways. So I said, I just happened to say that, and I was starting to read about the Ottoman Empire because I thought, I didn't know anything, and it was kind of ridiculous. I didn't know anything. I was going to fill in that hole. Well, when the students wrote a letter later on thanking me for coming, that's what they commented on. Nothing else I spoke about. They were just stunned that a college president could sort of like find this hole in his education, and actually without taking a course or being forced to, but would sort of say, oh, I need that. I need to know more about that. And I think it was striking because people don't talk about that much, that you might learn because you want to learn. And so I think we have to get better. And we don't have the structures yet. We haven't figured out how to do it. I understand there's always this rumor that Stanford's doing something special, in everything. Stanford's doing something special. And supposedly there's this idea that at Stanford you were going to be able to buy a certain number of years of education and then use it over a 30-year period whenever you had the motivation. And I don't think they actually did it. I don't think that's happened yet. But I do think figuring out how we can make that more real. And I think this is a potential consequence of the pandemic. The reality is that everyone from kindergarten to medical school has by necessity had to be sort of more engaged in their education, has to sort of be more of a driver. I think in lots of ways it sort of forced everyone to and this is a problem too, but everyone's had to be a little bit more on top of things in order to get it. And I think in some ways it'll be interesting to see if this grand experiment results in people being willing to seeing that they can teach themselves things, and maybe that's going to have a long tail, that people could actually see, I taught myself that one class. Actually, it went pretty well. And then realizing that they can do that for the rest of their lives. It'll be interesting to see. I'm sure there's some sociologist or demographer who 30 years from now will do this study before and after. And I can imagine it. I won't be around to last for that study.
Well, I will say, as a result of all this social upheaval and my taking on the dean's role, I've looked at a lot. I've been reading a bunch of different books that I didn't expect that I'd be reading to learn. And actually, it's been quite gratifying. And as you say, you grow as a person. So, we have a number of students who submitted questions, and they all kind of have this flavor that the world is changing. Can you guarantee that hard work and the financial cost of education will pay off, especially for people getting general degrees? And I don't think they're asking you to reinsure, but they want some reassurance.
Yeah. I think I think there's a compelling evidence base, even in the humanities, that there's a pretty good return on education even if you do it more just in the narrowest terms of sort of income and careers. I think the evidence base is pretty. Will it mean that everyone? No. We're talking about a population of people. Of course, not everyone. There'll be some distribution. Some will get more than others. But overall, I think the evidence is compelling on that front. But I really don't think that's the only part you should pay attention to. Because I do think when you think about it, when you look at the history of all of humans, how many humans have had the chance, once they've reached adulthood and can function, can hunt or mow or grow or actually function as an adult, to sort of pause for 4 years and to think and to engage in ideas. It's pretty extraordinary that this occurs for some. And when you look at the whole history of humans, there's this tiny little sliver of humans who've been able to do this. Mm-hmm. And I think there's worth there that's not just about the economic payoff. And it doesn't mean that it's not painful to have $150,000 in debt when you graduate. I get that. And I would advise, if at all possible, not to do that. There are all sorts of ways to try to be creative, but some have, for whatever reason, and there are lots of reasons why. I still think that there's this thing that goes beyond the economic return, which I think on average is pretty compelling. That goes beyond it. It's about the only thing you have that's only yours is your mind. It's like your mind is about the only thing that is absolutely. You can be enslaved as a person. My ancestors were slaves and were enslaved, but you know what? They had their minds. Mm-hmm. They still had that. And I think there's something about training your mind and exposing your mind to new ideas and ways of thinking about the world and all the things that come with a rich education that's almost priceless. Now, you can say, oh, it's easy for you to say. You don't have to pay out the debt. And I get that. But I do think that there's this, I encourage people to think beyond the obvious. And I think that in all sorts of ways, helping us to be better people in the community and helping us to be better parents and helping us to be better citizenship, and I'll let that go at that. We have some citizenship issues now. Those are important, and we don't talk about all that stuff. And that's as important in my mind as the direct financial impact.
Yeah, and I think also, how do we train people to be good citizens in a world of information technology and social media and the digitization of our dialogue that has really disrupted the traditional model, I think.
But I think that's even stronger argument for this broad-based education.
Yeah.
Because one thing a really good broad-based education does, it teaches you to have a sense when you're being sold a bill of goods. I mean, you sort of it gives you a sophistication of being able to assess things in a way, assess knowledge and to assess information and to integrate information and to reintegrate, and all those skills that are even more important in a world in which there's a lot of garbage out there on the internet. Sure. That's easily accessible and absolutely wrong.
No, and I think, certainly when I went to school, and maybe when you went to school, you went to the library and every source is authoritative, because it's the World Book or it's Britannica. And you didn't have to worry about whether it was real, and you just had to figure out where you got, where you found the data or the evidence that would help you. Now, of course, a lot of the information is downright false, and it's often questionable, and those critical thinking skills to assess those are more vital than ever. And,
yes.
I think we're trying to teach people to do that. So we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you, we've got one more question, and then I wanted to ask you a couple more questions. So, and one of the questions is really an economics question in some ways, that if the quality of education is falling, and that's a premise that I think you can argue against, but if the quality of the education is worse because it's not in person and costs are rising for all the reasons of dealing with a pandemic, what's going to be the outcome? How do you compensate for that? And I think we kind of talked about it, but I'll let you.
Well, I think, it's going to force a lot of painful conversations and decisions at institutions. And this is going to sound horrible, and this will bite me, I know, one day when this is brought back. In some ways, forcing the issue is sort of forcing a lot of institutions to make tough choices. And as hard as they are, there is this crystallization of thought that comes from being near the edge. and so Stanford and its sports programs, for example, where Stanford's sports programs are notorious. They produce all these Olympians, and I think they have more varsity sports than any other school in America, Division I. I mean, on and on and on.
Not more Olympians than USC. Sorry, keep going.
Okay. But it had that's one of its things. Yeah. These brilliant, but also athletic people who are wonderful. And yet even they had to cut some of those programs. And I think there's a reckoning that's coming where institutions are being forced, and it's painful. I mean, I don't mean in any way to minimize how painful it is. And real people are losing jobs, and it's just horrible in lots of ways. I'm hopeful that what will come out of this will be better. When I was planning to come to Andover, I discovered there's this whole genre of literature of bios and autobiographies and memoirs of headmasters from the 1800s on. And there are all these scores of them in England, and it seems like every headmaster in the world wrote a book about their experience. And it turns out that H.G. Wells wrote one about a biography of a guy named Sanderson, who was this really creative headmaster in England in the last part of the 1800s, the early part of the 1900s. And H.G. Wells knew him, so he wrote this biography about him. And there's this beautiful section that really resonated with me, and I was reading it during the pandemic, where it turned out that many of these schools in World War I, when he was at the peak of his career, these schools in England, all these boarding schools his school sent over 1,000, this one school, Undals, sent 1,000 people, 1,000 of its alumni to war. And many of them died, including his son, his beloved son. And there was this great section that H.G. Wells wrote about how this, as horrible as this was, the only way that he could make sense of this loss was that he saw the disruption of their society as this sort of leveling of the ground so that something better might come afterwards. This sort of like clearing of the ground that, as horrible as it was, maybe because everything was being so disrupted and there was such loss, and that there was an opportunity to rethink what came afterwards. And that stayed with me. This idea that as horrible as all this is, maybe there's an opportunity for us to sort of break out of our patterns of thinking and our institutional traditions and practices. And maybe there's a way for us to rethink our world in a way that might make us rebuild it in a better way.
Well, I think I'm going to ask one more question, but leave it on that optimism and ask you a personal question. We appreciate that optimism, which is, for a lot of people in academics, the goal is to be president of a college or a university. And you achieved that goal at a very young age. And now you left Grinnell to go to back to high school and boarding school. And I just would like to know why.
Well, first of all, I've never paid much attention to arbitrary lines of education. So when I was in high school, I think I went to Baltimore Polytechnic, which is this public science school in Baltimore. H.L. Mencken went there. It was where he learned to write, incidentally. And I left early, but I was taking classes at Johns Hopkins during the summer when I was 14. I finished medical school when I was 21. When I was in college, I was taking medical school classes and college classes. And then I went back to business school. So I've gone where my mind has led me, and I've never paid attention to these arbitrary lines separating disciplines or separating stages of education. And so when I got approached by Andover, I thought, that's odd. Why do they want me? But it turns out Andover it's this incredible institution. We have the Addison Gallery is one of the best museums of American art in the world. We have an archaeological institute that has 500,000 specimens. It is this extraordinary place. It was one of the founders of the AP system for advanced placements. So it's an unusual school. And I no longer see these lines separating high school and college and medical school and college. And I just don't pay attention to any of that. I focus on what I think is intellectually challenging and the institutions that have missions and values that I believe in. Andover is one of the few, I think the only of the elite boarding schools that has a need-blind admission policy and admits students without. And that wasn't always the case, although it was the first one in the 50s to do it. And then it sort of went back and forth. And then it's for the last 13 years or so, it's had an e-blind admissions policy. So I like challenges, and I don't pay much attention to what people think is the right way, what my career should be. I've never paid much attention to that. And so I'm consistently inconsistent. I'm consistely open to wherever. When I was looking at this job, I was looking at a presidency of a major museum, a not large scientific society. I was looking at a number of different jobs, and this one's sort of just appealed to me, and it's a great place.
Well, that's great. And I just want to close by saying, Dr. Kington, that you have been a friend to me, a colleague, and a mentor, actually. So I appreciate you taking the time. You always take the time, despite your busy schedule. And this was very insightful. And thank you, and thank the audience. And we're finishing on time. So
thank you. I hope I didn't say anything I'll regret.
I don't think so. It was fantastic. So
take care.
Bye.
My pleasure.